for having me, and thank you for kind of accommodating me at the end of this panel. I've been jumping between teaching on Teams and now presenting on Zoom, so that's been a fun experience of a day. I am indeed a postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London, and I'm here to talk about my British Academy funded project, which I've called Immersive Promotional Media. So the project investigates the aesthetic, narrative and affective connections between what I'm defining as immersive promotional media, brands and consumers. And the plan was to use interviews with producers and focus groups with consumers to paint a clearer picture of what immersive promotional media are, their role within media marketing strategies, and the value that these new kind of connections, whether they be aesthetic, narrative or effective, have for consumers and for producers. And my plan for this paper was to present to you some of the kind of initial data and findings from those interviews and from those focus groups. But COVID happened around about the same time I was due to start that data collection. So I've had to change things a little bit because what little data I have isn't really presentable at this point in time. So I'll be using the word anecdotally quite a lot. But I would really like to have kind of anyone's thoughts on how to do this kind of consumer research with immersive tech remotely, because I'm still trying to find ways and kind of alternatives to my previous plans. I'm mostly going to talk about the producer perspective, but I'm more than happy to talk about the audience aspect of the project in the Q&A afterwards as well, if anyone has any questions about that. So anecdotally, the term immersive has become something of a double-edged sword for marketers in kind of contemporary marketing and advertising. On the one hand, it continues to hold connotations of new, cutting-edge technology, participatory experiences that kind of excite and intrigue consumers and pique their curiosity and invite them to kind of discover advertising rather than have it thrown at them. But it's also now a term that has been applied to so many different experiences and so many kinds of experiences with different levels of participation or a lack of participation, that it's starting to lose meaning ever so slightly. Again, that's kind of anecdotally. And in particular, when I've spoken to immersive theatre producers, they've suggested that it's actually no longer a particularly useful term to indicate to their audiences what kind of experience to expect or what they might be asked to do when they get there. And this makes managing expectations really difficult. And it means they're more likely to have disappointed customers as a result. So on top of this kind of overuse of the term, in the UK, immersive is labelled as an emerging economic sector in its own right. And this is strongly focused on technology. So the way that the industry or this emerging sector or this emerging economy, whatever we're starting to call it, because these things are all very much in flux and very much changing, also confuses matters for audiences further, because they come to associate immersive experiences with technology and not with a particular kind or quality of experience. And many of these immersive promotional experiences that I'm looking at do tend to offer or denote some kind of active audience participation. But in reality, the extent of this varies wildly across all the different cases that I'm looking at. So just to pull one example up. So this is a promotional campaign for Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, which ran in the summer of June 2018. And it was a collaboration between Universal, Oculus, and Felix and Paul Studios. And essentially what they did was they put this huge shipping crate outside the front of King's Cross Station. and it kind of looked like it might have a T-Rex in it or a Velociraptor in it. Disappointingly, somewhat, it didn't. It just had lots of plastic fold-up chairs, lots of people dressed as park rangers, and lots of Oculus Go headsets, where you could watch this short VR clip created by Felix and Paul, which followed a story about Blue, one of the velociraptors in the film, trying to essentially survive as the volcano on the island erupts. And that's me having a go at that in that video playing at the bottom. So this was accompanied, this kind of digital aspect was accompanied by a much broader physical immersive installation, including a giant T-Rex coming out of the concourse, as you do. Some broken gyrospheres that kids were encouraged to kind of get into and have their photos taken with. Digital trailers running on screens and kind of wraps, poster wraps throughout the station to create this kind of immersive world of Jurassic World in King's Cross Station. And they also had on one of the platforms, as the doors opened to the train, they played the Jurassic Park theme tune as you disembarked from the train. So it was a fully multi-sensory experience. Similarly, this example is a short promotional campaign run in the summer of 2019 for a cider brand called Recorderlig, who set up a physical bar on the South Bank in London in July 2019. And in the corner of that bar was a small room where you could book a 5-minute Magic Leap experience. And this was also relatively kind of multi-sensory. The idea was to promote some new flavors of cider that were coming out at that time. So the room was actually piped full of kind of fruit flavored scent, so that it was a very kind of aromatic experience. And the lighting was quite dark, so you were kind of ushered into this very, very immersive and very small confined space, surrounded by geometric sets of forests and kind of a woodland set around you. So there were these physical props, as in the image on the left. So then you pop the Magic Leap goggles on, and before your eyes, various digital fruits would emerge, which you could interact with, and you could spin them around, you could prod them. I think there was a raspberry that kind of sparkles came out of when you prodded it. And it was all a little bit confusing. It was definitely very kind of immersive in some senses, but it was also a bit confusing and very short. So 3 minutes after you'd kind of figured out what you were doing in this promotional experience, the goggles were kind of whipped away from you. You were handed some samples of the cider. I think a coaster that had a Snapchat QR code on it that you could scan later. And you were told in no uncertain terms that you must use the hashtag on Twitter when you described this incredible immersive experience to all your friends on social media. So although this might have been a kind of an interesting experience to have, it was also very confusing and very over-branded in a lot of senses. And the appeal for a lot of these ideas and a lot of these immersive experiences, particularly the digital ones, is that the marketing industry is very interested in the quantitative metrics that are very easily derived from that kind of marketing content, and particularly from immersive experiences. This is an example from a VR advert that was developed for the film Jigsaw, part of the Saw horror franchise. And we can see that as part of this particular study, the interest is moving beyond the kind of typical impressions, unique user viewing rate metrics that perhaps people are used to seeing as part of digital marketing campaigns. But we're starting to look more at biometric indicators of attention spans and interpretations of physiological data as emotional indicators. So heart rate, eye movement, head movement, and correlating that with a level of satisfaction or kind of agreement with or pleasure that's being gained from these promotional experiences. And there are obviously kind of accompanying data ethics questions to be asked here, particularly as we see VR hardware markets further monopolized by players like Facebook, which we've already started a conversation about and is a whole other paper for a whole nother day, but I'm sure we could talk for much longer about those issues. But again, anecdotally, immersive content creators that are kind of working and making this kind of content are often keen to emphasize different kinds of engagement, emotional connections between consumers and these experiences, and the value of immersive storytelling and narrative. And trade press and professional handbooks in these areas tend to emphasize these very qualitative, the qualitative nature of experiential marketing. And they emphasize the importance of creating meaningful experiences, something that's much more subjective, much more intangible, and not necessarily something that we can measure or draw conclusions about from this kind of data that we can see. And it points to a more complex and more nuanced form of immersion that is perhaps more suited to the kinds of qualitative studies and frameworks developed by people like Gordon Colloque. But unfortunately, the kind of reality of the situation is that the best way to get company executives and brands interested in investing in these sorts of things is to be able to provide those quantitative metrics that they can translate into return on investment, sales, or brand loyalty. So there seem to be discrepancies in the ways in which different stakeholders in these production kind of projects value these immersive experiences. And these are mostly collaborations between brands, tech companies, and smaller immersive content producers, all looking for something slightly different from all these promotional strategies. One particularly pertinent example of this is Absolute Silver Point, which is a campaign designed essentially to promote this limited edition Andy Warhol bottle of Absolute vodka. It was branded as a digital R&D experiment, not as a piece of marketing, quite explicitly not as a piece of marketing. And it ran for 2 weeks no, it wasn't 2018. I think it was April 2015. Sorry, that's an error. But it involved these 4 very different stakeholders. So Absolute, the vodka brand, the immersive theatre company Punch Drunk, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the boutique marketing agency Something Else. And between them, they developed this mobile puzzle game, which you can see on the right, which was very kind of bejeweled Candy Crush style, but is features and is inspired by the aesthetic of Andy Warhol's lesser known Silver Point sketches. So that's where that kind of comes in. And as you level up, it reveals a story about a missing girl called Chloe, who starts leaving you voicemails and sending you messages. To win the game, you had to take the game out physically into bars and restaurants in North London to increase your score. And those who did were eventually invited to a finale, which took place in a warehouse basement where there was an immersive theatre performance by Punch Drunk, where you discovered the secret of Chloe's disappearance. So there's lots of questions to be asked here about who is getting what out of this piece of advertising or this R&D experiment, depending how we look at it. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I've only got a couple of slides left. I hope that's all right. So I'm interested in using Sarah Atkinson and Helen Kennedy's framework or concept of a VR production ecosystem to better understand the ways that these collaborations work, what stakeholder expectations are, and comparing them to the ways that these are received by audiences. So Atkinson and Kennedy look at this in the context of theatrical arts, and they identify collaborations between tech companies, VR creatives, and cultural organizations. And each of these have a kind of overlapping values and are seeking to get overlapping things from these projects. excuse me. And that ranges from increasing income streams and brand awareness to application and evolution of new technologies, new artistic and creative practice, and audience exposure to all of these things, which all three sets of stakeholders kind of share as a key value derived from these projects. And you can see that they've identified several projects ranging from things that have been developed for the National Theatre, for the RSC, in collaboration with companies like Oculus and with Sky, and then with more small and medium-sized enterprises who are the kind of VR creatives behind a lot of the content. So if I try and apply that framework to some of the examples that I've mentioned today, there are definitely some similarities. And we can see that there are these collaboration structures that are emerging between media organizations and brands, tech companies, and smaller immersive content producers, many of whom grew out of visual effects industries, most of whom do some form of branded work, but have lots of other non-commercial creative projects that they're doing as well. So they're working in a branded and commercial environment, but it's not necessarily key to their organizational cultures and organizational values. And we should also start to question how long these kind of arrangements are going to last, and whether larger organizations like Warner Brothers might start to bring these sorts of things in-house and potentially retain more control over the IP that is generated from these projects, rather than working in this kind of collaborative way in the future. And if we look at those kind of four values in this context, there are also some kind of applications there that we can see in some crossovers. So there is a potential here to generate increased income streams, but that's possibly more a priority for arts organizations that Atkinson and Kennedy are talking about, which are relying on increasingly diverse streams of income. It certainly improves the brand awareness of the technology company. On that shipping crate on the Jurassic Park experience, the Oculus logo on the outside is near enough the same size as that Jurassic Park logo on the side of that crate. So it's just as important a piece of marketing for Oculus as it is for Universal. And it can potentially create a more accessible way of showcasing that technology's capabilities, because these are often very public installations, or they're embedded in retail spaces. Magic Leap is a good example of the application and evolution of new technologies. That particular kind of the cider-based, slightly questionable cider-based experience. It's a good example of that, given that Magic Leap is not a technology that's been available to the public barely at all. And so provides them with an interesting test bed to see how that goes down. But marketers and large media conglomerations are often quite risk averse, whereas creatives and technologists tend to be more keen on experimentation. So there's an interesting kind of dynamic there, which might hinder some of that application, depending on the dynamics of that working relationship. The evolution of new creative and artistic practices in this context might translate to new modes of brand storytelling, exploring new ways to communicate with consumers beyond linear storytelling, or looking at the possibilities of world building for brands. And for companies like Punchdrunk, it might be a place where they can find ways to incorporate the digital in ways that they hadn't expected into their own kind of physical productions. And so for them, Silverpoint really was validly a research and development proposal, rather than just a piece of marketing for Punchdrunk. And finally, all these examples are exposing audiences to new aesthetic and new entertainment experiences, not so much the kind of the sharing of high culture examples that Atkinson and Kennedy were working on, but certainly aesthetic and entertainment experiences that at this point in time are not commonly available in home. And for a lot of people that are engaging with these things, it's possibly the only kind of place, the first place that they'll engage with that sort of technology. I'll finish now, I'm sorry. So I'm sorry that I didn't have any more interesting interview data to present to you today, but I hope it's given you an insight into the project and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have about it. So thank you very much.